Good day. There's been, as I've discussed in recent programmes, a number of articles appearing in the British media about the fighting, and the Western media generally, about the fighting in Bakhmut, which, as I have said, has always struck me as being by far the biggest, most important, most intense battle fought over the course of the Ukraine conflict, even though until very recently it has been largely ignored by the media in the West. Anyway, there's today another article, this one in the Financial Times in Britain, which, needless to say, reports on this story very much from the Ukrainian side. And of course you get many of the same tropes that we've been hearing previously. The title of the article is Hell, Just Hell, Ukraine and Russia's War of Attrition over Bakhmut. And then the subtitle says, soldiers fighting in and around East Donetsk city say fighting is reminiscent of First World War style trench conflict. I should say these are Ukrainian soldiers, because the entire reporting of this article is clearly made from a Ukrainian perspective. And of course you have many of the usual standard claims that you now read from Ukraine, from Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian soldiers describing the fighting in Bakhmut. They say that there's the usual stories I remember from the earlier in the war, indeed going all the way back, if you follow reports, accounts of wars that the Russians have been involved in. There's the common trope of Russians advancing towards defended positions and getting mowed down and yet still coming on. Well, it's fascinating to see how that particular story is being repeated here in the Financial Times, this time from the Ukrainians. So we learn about how rockets and mortars rained down on Ukrainian military positions. Then came the Russian infantry charging in a First World War style attack across a no man's land of shredded trees and artillery craters. The Ukrainians popped up and mowed down many of them with machine guns and grenade launchers. This isn't, by the way, a witness account by the reporter. It's clearly based on an account from the Ukrainians. And then we go on to read how moments later the scenes were repeated, although this time the Russian fighters had to navigate their comrades' bodies. Again, many were cut down by Ukrainian bullets. It was like a conveyor belt, Konstantin, an exhausted Ukrainian machine gunner who described the scene to the Financial Times, said of the Russian tactics. I'm going to say straight away, I don't believe any of that. Everything about the way in which the fighting in Bakhmut has been conducted ever since it began back in August suggests very careful incremental advances by the Russians, backed by very heavy artillery. The soldier in question, somebody called Konstantin, it seems to me, has been carefully prepared to give this kind of account to the British journalist. And notice that he goes on to say that Bakhmut is a meat grinder. Of course, the expression that Prigozhin, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, has used to describe what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. But now you have Konstantin taking that expression of Prigozhin's and repeating it back, but trying to reverse it, trying to attribute it to, trying to make out that it's the Russians who are experiencing the meat grinder effect. Well, can I just say that if you, however, read the article carefully, it becomes clear that the situation for the Ukrainians is deteriorating. We learn how the Ukrainian soldiers described the intensity of the recent fighting in and around Bakhmut, particularly the artillery barrages, as greater than anything they had experienced anywhere in Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in February. We have a Ukrainian senior officer describing it all as hell, just hell, hell for the Ukrainians themselves. We hear another soldier warning the FT that if they go closer to the front line, I'll pray for you and you should pray for yourself. We then go on to read further along, further in the article, that there are places that the Russians have now broken into the eastern suburbs of Bakhmut. In other words, they're fighting inside the city itself. That the central area of the city centre, has been turned into a hedgehog, angled metal bars and other anti-tank defences blocking the main avenues. So clearly it's becoming a battle that's there. We go on to read that over the course of Monday morning, when the FD visited, there was rarely more than 5 seconds between artillery explosions. It goes on to say on both sides of the front line, but the Ukrainians themselves have admitted that in the fighting in Bakhmut, they are very, very heavily outgunned, something that this article doesn't talk about. The FT article speaks about the ground shaking, and the otherwise clear sky was hazy from the smoke. Russian drones could be heard buzzing overhead, apparently looking for targets. We go on to read further along that the military units there, that the Ukrainian forces are facing fighting reminiscent of the type of fighting that took place earlier in the war in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, with Ukrainian forces being incredibly heavily shelled by Russian artillery, though it should be said that other Ukrainian officials deny that things are apparently quite as bad and dispute the logic of the Russian offensive. And then perhaps the most interesting moment in the article, at the very end, when the Ukrainians briefly lose control of the narrative, because the reporter from the FT, the Financial Times, meets a Ukrainian, a resident, I should say, of Bakhmut, a man in his 50s. He said he was no longer afraid of dying, and then he said he did not want to go home because it had been struck 3 times by artillery shells and was missing some of its walls. He blamed Ukrainian forces for the damage, saying they had moved into his neighborhood and made it a target by bringing the war to his doorstep. And we then have Konstantin, the same soldier who told us, the Ukrainian soldier who told us about how he'd been mowing down the Russians, the waves of Russians with his machine gun, who we're told was a veteran of the fighting in Bucha near Kiev in March. He says that the attitude of Vitaly, the resident of Bakhmut, is common. That a lot of people there apparently blame the Ukrainians, even though Vitaly goes on to say if they want to go to Russia, or take them to the front line and show them the way, gesturing to the battlefield, which, if you think about it, is a sort of somewhat double-edged thing. It might suggest that Russia is indeed advancing in this area, and moreover, that Bakhmut, Donetsk, Donbass, those parts of the territory of these areas now controlled by the Russians is indeed, as the Russians say, Russia. Anyway, it's an interesting article because, as I said, though it tries to spin the story very much from a Ukrainian perspective, as I said, all that story about, waves of Russian soldiers crashing against Ukrainian defenses, being mowed down by Ukrainian machine guns. As I said, these are archaic tropes, always repeated about the Russians. I've seen them in every account of every war the Russians have ever fought. People write about them in this kind of way. If you ignore that, if you set that aside, you get a clear picture of a severely deteriorating picture of the Ukrainian forces being heavily shelled, of the Ukrainian forces fighting in conditions of hell, of people who go into the center of Bakhmut being at risk of their lives, of Bakhmut center now having become heavily fortified, though apparently in a somewhat ad hoc, clumsy kind of way, of Russian drones flying overhead, and of shelling similar in scale to that in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk back in the early summer. And lastly, we have the resident of Bakhmut blaming the Ukrainians and saying that they're responsible for his suffering, and the Ukrainian soldier admitting that this was a widespread view in Bakhmut. So, quite a revealing article, as I said, if read with a careful eye. And in fact, coming back now to the Russian reporting of the fighting, a Russian official has now actually come forward and said that the fighting in Bakhmut is indeed the most intense of the war, and that Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut are now higher, that their daily losses in Bakhmut are greater than they were during the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Now, I would say that at the peak of that fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, the Ukrainians were admitting that they were losing 1,000 men killed every day. The Russians are not putting Ukrainian losses as high as that. They talk about dead and wounded, as I said in my video yesterday, the equivalent of a battalion, a battalion of troops lost in terms of dead and wounded every day. But anyway, they're claiming now that Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut are at least at the level of the fighting at Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and perhaps quite possibly greater still. And it's not just that the fighting is continuing to be very intense, but the Russians, there was a Russian official, I think he's from the Lugansk People's Republic, he talks about Ukraine continuing to try and send reinforcements into Bakhmut, around apparently 500 men at a time, about the fact that many of these soldiers that have been sent into Bakhmut are poorly trained and easily, as a result, rapidly become casualties in this appalling battle. We are also getting reports, and they're now also starting to come from Ukrainian sources, that the shortages in ammunition are now starting to have a severe impact on the Ukrainians' ability to withstand this Russian bulldozer that's heading towards them in Bakhmut. And one gets the impression, the sense that things are beginning to get very difficult for Ukraine, not just in Bakhmut, but across the entire conflict zone. And whilst I'm on that subject, I read a report, this is on a Russian channel, Can't say to what extent this is true, but anyway, the report claimed that losses in tanks and armored vehicles on the part of Ukraine are now so severe, and resupplies of tanks and armored vehicles from Ukraine's NATO allies are becoming so sporadic and so limited that by March, around 50% of the Ukrainian forces on the front lines will be reduced to moving around on light pickup trucks, which would of course make them desperately vulnerable to Russian artillery. And I've also heard this same source claim that by the summer or early autumn, if trends like this continue, the Ukrainian army will be down to to 70%, having to rely for movement on the battlefields on light pickup trucks instead of armored vehicles. And whilst I'm on the topic of armor, one of the reasons that the Russians claim that the Ukrainians are suffering all these very heavy losses in and around Bakhmut is that they have a shortage of armored vehicles in the city and in the areas around, and that this means that the Ukrainian infantry isn't getting the necessary level of protection, and that the Russians, by contrast, move forward under armor in tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and that's one of the reasons why their losses are much lower. Anyway, that's what we hear about what both sides are now admitting is the most intense battle of the war. It's a horrible battle. All of the information about how horrible it is coming from the Ukrainian side. I see nothing analogous from the Russian side. I don't hear any reports. I have not seen any reports from any Russian channel, any Russian source, even those highly critical of the Putin government, that suggest that things on their side in the fighting in Bakhmut are anything like as bad. So I just want to make that last point, because it is clear that Bakhmut is indeed turning into a meat grinder. Horrible word. I loathe it, but it's been used now by so many. But anyway, it is a meat grinder, and it is the Ukrainians, so it seems to me, the overwhelming evidence points to it being so. It is the Ukrainians who are being put through that grinder. Well, that leads me on to some of the other topics that I'm going to discuss today. How did we get here? Well, there's been another interview by Angela Merkel, this time in Die Zeit, which is, I believe, one of the other German newspapers. Merkel seems to be speaking to various German media outlets in a rather desperate attempt to try and repair her reputation in some way. Anyway, in this interview, she again repeated what she'd said in the interview to Der Spiegel, that she'd never really taken the Minsk agreement seriously, that the Minsk agreement was simply entered into in order to buy time for Ukraine, that Ukraine used that time to build up its forces, that as a result, Ukraine is in a much better position to resist the Russians now than it would have been back in 2014. This has now been picked up in Russia. It has led to criticism of Merkel, unsurprisingly, from the Russians. Maria Zakharova, the waspish spokesman of the Russian Foreign Ministry, has said that this kind of admission from Merkel might be a topic of war crimes trial Well, I'm not going to go there. I'm not convinced that's the case. But anyway, that's what Zakharova said. The Russians are clearly reading all of this, and I think it is hardening their distrust, their mistrust, or rather, I should say, their collapse in trust in the West. There's been a speech now by the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. He's saying that there's no point any longer in talking to the EU. The EU are people that the Russians now realize they can't work with, they can't trust. That what the Russians must do instead is focus on those entities that they can work with, the BRICS group, which Lavrov predicts is going to be expanding very soon, the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is the Russian-led military alliance, the Eurasian Economic Community, which is meeting in the, I believe it's the Kyrgyz capital, Bishkek. Putin is there. He's delivering speeches. I'm going to discuss all of those in my next program tomorrow. I'm still only getting partial accounts of what he said and what the others are saying. And of course, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, like the BRICS group, includes China. And it's these groups that Lavrov now says that the Russians must work with, because the West, the EU, cannot be trusted. That there's no point in wasting time with entities like the EU, because the EU, when it meets with the Russians, when it reaches agreements with the Russians, is doing so in bad faith. And that's the takeaway that the Russians are making from Merkel's interviews. Now, I'm going to say straight away, I'm going to repeat what I've said before. I think Merkel is again being less honest than with the German media, less than honest with the German media. I think when she signed the Minsk agreement, when she, as a guarantor, I should say, back in February 2015, I suspect that despite what she says now, she did perhaps think that it might eventually result in some kind of settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. I remember there was a long article that appeared in Der Spiegel just directly after the agreement, the Minsk agreement that was reached at that time. And it struck me at the time that this article was clearly sourced from the German Chancellery, in other words, from Merkel herself, in which the article said that Ukraine had to face realities. It had to accept that both Crimea and Donbass, or at least these territories that were at that time occupied by the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, were irretrievably lost. That was what that article said. And it appeared also to me to be saying that the conflict in Ukraine needed to be contained and brought to an end. And of course, short time later, Merkel came along to Moscow and committed Germany to the Nord Stream 2 project, which I can't quite believe that she would have done if she was really expecting the war to resume. But Merkel, as I've often said, is a serpentine character. She will agree and commit to something one day, and then when it looks like the obstacles are too high, she will flip and turn the other way. And it became very clear that Ukraine was never going to abide by Minsk. It also became very clear that the British and the Americans were intent on sabotaging Minsk, and that the Minsk process was also opposed by other EU states, notably Poland and the Baltic states, and also the Netherlands. And Merkel was not going to put her position at risk by insisting on the implementation of Minsk in the face of all of these forces. And from that point, she did do what she says in these interviews. She strung the Russians along, pretending that she supported Minsk when in fact she'd lost interest in it. So I have to say that I have to also say that it ultimately makes no difference whether Merkel was stringing the Russians along from the outset or started to string the Russians along sometime after Minsk was agreed, when she realized that the problems of getting Minsk put together were becoming insurmountable, at least politically difficult, maybe not insurmountable, but politically difficult. But anyway, that is what she did. And of course, the result is this total collapse of trust between the Russians and the Germans, and the Russians and the Europeans. I think that the Russians have never actually trusted the Americans very much. I should perhaps say that. I don't think they've felt for a long time that they could work with the Americans on anything, but I think that they did have a residual belief until about 2 years ago, perhaps, until the Navalny affair really took off. They had a residual belief that maybe, just possibly, the Germans especially would come to their senses. They would understand how important the relationship between Germany and Russia was, extending as it does all the way back to the middle period of the Cold War, how important it is, how much benefit Germany has derived from it. I think there was always some lingering hope in Russia, in Moscow, that the Germans would not want to jeopardize that relationship. I think the Russians have now come to the conclusion that all those hopes that they placed in Germany were misplaced, and for that reason, as I said, trust between the Russians and the Germans, and between the Russians and the Europeans, has now irretrievably collapsed. So, let's go back to the military situation. We've discussed the fighting in Bakhmut. We've had this very interesting article in the Financial Times. There's just a couple of things about the state of the war that I want to talk about. Now, I got one of these very interesting articles I get from emails I get from time to time. A particular member of the Duran community asked me whether it was actually true that, all these heavy volumes of Russian artillery fire that we hear about somehow is a reflection of the fact that the Russian artillery isn't particularly accurate, so they try to make up for their accuracy by these enormously heavy bombardments, and that the Ukrainians, using Western artillery, which is much more precise, especially with Excalibur rounds, well, that they can achieve more with a single round of artillery than the Russians can with presumably 100 of theirs. Well, I think this Financial Times article and all the reporting from Bakhmut exposes the fallacy of that argument. Volume, clearly, in an artillery war matters. It matters who is able to launch the most shells. That is what destroys military units, chews up armies, obliterates tanks, destroys vehicles, makes defending almost impossible. Now, there is a fundamental difference between the way in which Russian artillery is organized and the way Western artillery is organized. And if we look at Western guns, and I think this is true of weapons, Western weapons in general, you can see that they are very high-tech, very expensive, made in limited quantities, launching limited numbers of shells, prioritizing accuracy over everything. Whereas the Russians do have some artillery which is as high-tech and as accurate, and by the way, as long-ranged as anything that you find in the West. I've already talked about in previous programs the self-propelled 203mm Matka gun, which can outrange Western guns. It seems to be as accurate as Western guns. There's also the 152 millimeter Star self-propelled gun, also very advanced Russian gun, self-propelled gun, as accurate, as precise with its ordinary shells as Western guns are with their ordinary shells. And if you're talking about precision rounds, well, the Western powers have the Excalibur rounds, which obviously have GPS guidance. The Russians don't have anything exactly equivalent, but they do have something called the Krasnopol, which is also a guided shell. It uses an older technology, one, by the way, which the Americans, as far as I know, pioneered with a round called the Copperhead, artillery round called the Copperhead, which has now been replaced by the GPS-guided Excalibur. Anyway, like the Copperhead, the Krasnopol uses laser guidance, which means that you need a laser designator, either a drone or a forward observer. But anyway, the Russians do have the ability to place shells accurately if they need to, and to engage in counter-battery work. But the Russians also have an enormous amount of simpler, older artillery. A lot of the guns, a lot of the artillery that the Russians have been using in Ukraine are D-20 guns or gun howitzers. I'm not going to enter in the discussion about the distinction. This is not my field. But anyway, these guns were developed by the Soviet Union and brought into service in the mid-1950s. And it's a kind of gun which the United States and Britain would not be deploying today. It's old, it's strong, reliable, rugged. It can launch vast numbers of shells, but it doesn't have the range of some of the more modern guns. It doesn't have the same accuracy as some of the more modern guns. And the Russians have vast numbers of these guns in reserve. They're bringing them out of reserves. They're deploying them with their troops. And of course, these guns may be somewhat old, though, as I said, reliable and strong. And of course, they bulk out the massive volumes of shells which we see the Russians launching. And we have the same thing happening, by the way, with rocket artillery. So as far as I can tell, all HIMARS rockets, all the rockets the HIMARS system launches are guided. They use precision guidance, GPS guidance. And as Brian Beletic explained in a fascinating video that he did, the Russians have their equivalent, the Tornado system, which comes in various forms, by the way. And it too launches guided rockets, similar to the HIMARS. And the Russians have a substantial number of these, and they're appearing more widely on the battlefields. And some of them have apparently been operational, launching strikes against Kharkiv city from Russian lines, which tells us that, like the HIMARS system, these rockets, that the Tornado launches, can be both long range and very precise. But alongside the high-tech, accurate Tornado system, the Russians also continue to field and make large numbers of more old-fashioned, if you like, unguided multiple rocket launch systems like the Grad, the Uragan, the Smerch. These are all older systems, some going back to the 1960s, mid-1960s, 1970s. They launch unguided rockets far cheaper than those of the Tornado and of the HIMARS, and they're able to launch these in enormous volumes again. So the Russians have the ability to launch precise long-range strikes with their artillery, but they also clearly believe that mass matters. And we see from articles like that in the FT how that is indeed important, how that is having the effect that the Russians wanted to have, how launching vast numbers of shells, vast numbers of rockets does actually matter on the battlefield, as just as being able to strike precisely and accurately at one particular location also does. The difference between the Russians and the West is that the Russians have both precise, accurate artillery, modern artillery, and as I said, high volume artillery. In the West, we only have the high precision, accurate, more fragile artillery. I suspect that the Western procurement system, the military industrial complex in the United States, the US military as well, the British military, points now I'm going to make, which Brian Beletic discusses better. If they were asked by, say, someone in the White House, why can't we build large numbers of unguided rocket systems like the Russians have to fill out, to ramp up vast volumes of fire? Well, I suspect the military industrial complex, the US military, would say, we're not prepared to accept these crude weapons. Why would we want to when the accurate, highly precise HIMARS is so much more modern, so much more accurate, and so much more precise? They would, in other words, push for more HIMARS systems. And that would, of course, mean that the United States would not be able to match the kind of volumes that the Russians can on the battlefields. And that is why, at this precise moment in time, the West finds itself running out of ammunition, running out of guns, running out of systems it can send to Ukraine, whereas the Russians appear to have unending supplies of these things, because the Russians can maintain their volumes, because doing so is cheap and simple, because so are many of their systems, and of course they only rely on their more expensive systems when they have to. Anyway, that's enough of that. Now, there's a very interesting article, rather video, discussion which Brian Beletic did with the military analyst Mark Sloboda on the new Atlas, discussing the various state of things on the battlefronts, but also the future direction of the war. And there's also been, contrary-wise, a equally interesting discussion about what might be coming in the war from the military summary channel. And I should say that the analysis, the predictions made in these two programs about the direction of any Russian winter offensive are different. So Mark Sloboda, the new Atlas, they appear to see the future very much along the lines of what Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis discussed in that article I talked about before. Major Russian advance from Belarus, encircling Kiev, cutting off Ukrainian supplies, doing all that sort of, from the West, doing all that sort of thing. Whereas the military summary channel and a correspondent who's emailed me privately, but who served in the US military, they take a different view. They think that the major Russian advance will be in Kharkiv region and in the area of the Oskol River, and that it will complement, in other words, the fighting in Donbass. Now, I don't know which of these views are true, but you can watch the respective videos and listen to the arguments and decide for yourself. But my own opinion, and I continue to hold this, is that the Russians will take the more conservative approach. They will most probably focus their offensive on the Oskol line, on Kharkiv region, and in Donbass. They will want to break Ukrainian resistance there. And they want to do that because that's where the best forces of the Ukrainian army are and have been, by the way, ever since the start of this war. And the Ukrainians are compounding the problem by continuing to send reinforcements to places like Bakhmut, where they're being obliterated by the Russians in the way that I've discussed many times. And as this person who served in the US military pointed out to me in this email that he sent me, if the Russians actually do launch what seems on the face of it to be a limited offensive in this area, in Kharkiv and Donbass, and if that offensive succeeds, given the condition of the Ukrainian military, the fact that it's suffering all these enormous losses, that it's struggling to keep up in its supplies of ammunition, artillery, that these supplies from the West are now dwindling. This person has suggested that the Ukrainians are now having an accumulation of problems, and that all of these various problems are feeding into each other. And though he's careful not to predict this, he says that if the Russians were to launch this rather more conservative offensive, and if that offensive were to achieve success, then it is possible that this could actually provoke a very big crisis on the part of the Ukrainian military and might even trigger a collapse. So, anyway, that's what this person says. I come back to what I said. I still take the view that the Russians will take this conservative approach. Having said that, there is something that's now happened, or rather that's been happening for a long time, but which is now being reported by the British Defence Ministry, which might point in the other direction. And that is that ever since Surovikin took charge of the Russian military involved directly in this conflict, the Russians have been building fortified lines, fortifications, all across the front lines. And the British Ministry of Defence now says that these fortified lines are now becoming a continuous belt, particularly in northern Donbass, along the border with Kharkiv region. And I'm getting more and more reports about how complex and dense these fortifications are becoming. And it seems to me that one possible argument in favour of the Daniel Davis, Mark Sloboda perspective is that perhaps the purpose of all of these fortified lines is to hold the Ukrainians back, to prevent them launching any kind of sudden counterattacks in eastern Ukraine when the Russian forces move south from Belarus, perhaps towards Kiev, perhaps further west to cut off the supply routes to the Ukrainian army. Well, I mean, I'm not a military expert. Perhaps I'm wrong about that. I just throw that out as a possibility. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this. It's been an interesting discussion. Of course, none of us knows what the Russians are actually planning to do. We'll just have to wait and see. But the weather is now turning colder. There's still periods of alternative snow and then rain, so you get this strange period of ice, snow melting again, boggy ground and that sort of thing. So we're not yet into the very hardened, frosted ground. So advances are still a bit difficult. And besides, it does seem as if, following on from my program of yesterday, that the Russians have not yet fully completed their deployments, and that their offensive plans are probably still some weeks away. I'm not sure whether I mentioned it in my previous program, by the way, but I've heard it suggested that if the Russians are indeed creating entirely new formations out of the 150,000 troops that are still in Russia, reservists that are still in Russia, still experiencing training, as Putin said, if they're creating entirely new formations from these troops, that actually training troops and training units to the point where they can actually operate as units in battle is going to take several months more, and we're looking at these units being used perhaps in February, March, rather than sooner. Well, possibly. The Russian plan is first an attack in Kharkiv towards the Oskol line in the winter, and a major attack in Bakhmut, breaking resistance, Ukrainian resistance there, and perhaps moving forward towards the Dnieper, followed perhaps in March by a strike south from Belarus with these new forces. Who knows? Anyway, there we go. We will see what happens. Now, I've focused a lot in this program about the war. I'm going to touch briefly on this exchange. Victor Bolt, the alleged, well, convicted, I suppose, the US courts convicted him of arms dealing, this prisoner that the Americans had, who they have built up into this sinister arms dealer figure. I'm going to simply say that I think that Bolt probably has broken the laws in some places, perhaps almost certainly has traded in arms, probably in an illegal and dodgy way. But I think he was a minor player in a very sinister and very huge scene. I mean, I think that arms trafficking goes on such an enormous scale that Bolt himself was just a minor figure in it. I mean, we already hear about $20 billion of weapons apparently in Ukraine that can't be accounted for, $80 billion of weapons that went to Afghanistan. Compare that with the tens of millions of weapons, which is what Bolt allegedly traded in, and you get a sense of what an insignificant figure he really was. But anyway, putting all that aside, there's been a lot of commentary in the US about the exchange of Bolt for Griner, the basketball player. I'm not going to get into the details of that story. Well, we simply I should say we've covered it in detail in a specific video we've done about it on the Duran. All I will say about it is this. The United States, the Biden administration, seems to be trying to use these prisoner exchanges, just as they've also been trying to use the nuclear talks about nuclear weapons, as a mechanism for restarting discussions with the Russians. And US Secretary of State Blinken has come up again with this old mantra that the United States obviously is in conflict with the Russians, will continue to pursue an adversarial relationship with the Russians, but it is prepared to talk and work with the Russians on matters which are of interest to the United States. Now, there was a lot of talk about this, a lot of referencing to this mantra, both with the Chinese and the Russians, by officials of the Biden administration before the conflict in Ukraine started. We haven't heard so much about it recently, but the Americans seem to be trying to reactivate it again. And the important thing is this: the Russians are saying no, they're not prepared to work on that basis. We saw that when the US Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, William Burns, went to Ankara to meet with the Russian intelligence chief, Sergei Narishkin. The word from Washington was that the meeting would be about the prisoner exchanges, of which we've now seen the results, and strategic stability, in other words, nuclear arms. Narishkin, when he got back to Moscow, made it very clear, however, that in fact the main topic of discussion was actually Ukraine. So the United States tried to avoid discussing Ukraine with the Russians, but the Russians apparently and successfully insisted in discussing Ukraine. And I think that the way in which this particular exchange has worked out, that the United States was not able to get Paul Whelan back, shows that the Russians are prepared to play hardball on every issue. They're prepared to. They were refused, for example, to discuss nuclear weapons, engage the United States in nuclear weapons talks, or on any subjects, any subject that the United States wants to limit the discussion to. The Russians are saying, we can't proceed on the basis that we talk about the things that interest you, but you don't talk about the things, we don't talk about the things that interest us. We either talk about everything or we talk about nothing. We either move forward on every problem in our relationship or we remain at complete standstill. Now, in some ways, that's still an advance on having no discussions at all. It's different from the situation between the Russians and Europe, where the Russians are essentially saying, we've no interest in discussing anything with Europe any longer. That's essentially what Sergei Lavrov was saying. The Russians are saying we are prepared to engage with the United States. Ultimately, the United States is a superpower. We have to live with them just as they have to live with us. But we're not prepared to do this on the kind of terms that people like Blinken are talking about. If the Americans want to talk to us about things that concern them, then they must realize that we will only do that on the basis that we are also able to talk about the things which concern us. So that's, it seems to me, where we are at the present time in the situation, both in the conflict, in the war, and in the discussions between the various conflicting parties, by which I mean in this case the Russians on the one hand, the collective West on the other, the United States and the European Union. As I said, as I've been making this program, there's been an awful lot coming through about the comments that Putin has been making at the meeting in Bishkek. Turns out it's not just the Eurasian Economic Union, it's also simultaneously a meeting of the Collective Treaty Security Organization. So there's an awful lot being talked about and discussed, lots of important events no doubt taking place there. But Putin is making a major speech, and apparently he's also touched on the Merkel comments, Merkel's assertions that she'd never really intended to take Minsk seriously. I gather that Putin says that he's disappointed to hear this, but I haven't read the full text of his comments. That, as I said, you'll have to learn about in my next video, which is coming out tomorrow. Thank you for joining me again today. Let me remind you once more that you can find all of our videos, Duran videos, Alexander Mercouris videos, Alex Christoforou videos on our other platforms. Locals, where we have our thriving community, which you can join, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. And you can also support our work if you choose to through Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and find the amazing things that you will see there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, as I said, with my comments about Putin's latest speech. He seems on a roll. He seems to be making one big speech or comment after another. As I think Dmitry Orlov said a few days ago, the man, Putin, looks almost liberated. He's finally able to say things that one senses he's felt and believed for a long time, but he's not been able to say before. And the result is a stream of speeches, and I will try to keep up with them. So thank you again for joining me, and more from me soon.